We are going to be taking our notes over the components of muscles today. Let's see how it goes. You'll need your notebook. You're going to write this down in the input side of your notebook today, as you do every time we take notes. Remember that the yellow headings, yellow refers to the headings in these notes, the blue refers to vocabulary, and the green refers to important information. Okay, so let's get started. Your essential question for today is, how is the process of muscle growth different from other systems, such as the skin and bones? As we get through these notes, you will be able to answer that question, so please jot it down in your notes and answer it as we get through it in the notes today. All right, we're going to start here with the nerve and blood supply of the muscle system. All right, each skeletal muscle is supplied by a nerve, artery, and two veins. Okay, now you may remember from your cardiovascular system that you studied before, in maybe your biology class or in maybe some of your middle school science classes. An artery is a blood vessel that carries oxygenated blood from the lungs, or it comes from the lungs into the heart, and then the heart pumps it back out through the body through the arteries. Your veins carry deoxygenated blood from your organs, in this case would be your muscles, back into the heart, which goes to the lungs, and so on. Okay. Then each motor neuron supplies multiple muscle cells at the neuromuscular junction. Now, we talked about this a little bit the other day when we were covering our vocabulary before we took our little quiz. The neuromuscular junction is that combination of the neuron, which is from the nervous system, and the muscle itself. Okay, the neuromuscular junction is where the nervous system or the nerve comes and joins with the muscle tissue. Okay, that's what it is. Each muscle cell is supplied with one motor neuron terminal branch and is in contact with one or two capillaries. Okay, so each muscle has a nerve, artery, and two veins, and then each muscle cell has a motor neuron terminal, so that means each of these little dudes down here, that's where there's a muscle cell. Okay, and there are one or two capillaries, and those capillaries would be those blood vessels, either the arteries or the veins that are taking the blood from the muscle tissue or supplying the blood to the muscle tissue. Okay, next here, myoblasts into muscle fibers. Okay, so myoblasts, these are the stem cells, these are the precursor cells of the developing fetus of an individual as they're growing in their mother's uterus, and then they develop into muscle fibers. So let's see how this works. Every mature muscle cell is developed from about 100 myoblasts that fuse together in the fetus. This is what gives rise to each muscle cell being multinucleated. Okay, so each muscle cell or muscle fiber is actually made up of about 100 of these precursor cells, which are those stem cells, the myoblasts. Then mature muscle cells cannot divide, which means they do not go through mitosis. What they do though, is as they grow, mature muscle cells, they grow, it's a result of cellular enlargement and not mitosis. So once these muscle fibers are established as being mature, and it would be in the next level, they do not reproduce and make more muscle cells. What they do is they get bigger based upon the different nutrients that are there and how much they're being worked. Okay, satellite cells retain the ability to regenerate new cells. Okay, so these satellite cells, which we see here in this illustration here, the satellite cell comes in and enables this muscle fiber to add to it or strengthen it in such a way. Okay, it's kind of like slapping some plaster on a hole in a wall or something. Okay. Evidence suggests that these cells are capable of fusing with existing myofibers to facilitate growth and repair. All right, so these satellite cells are kind of like those repair cells. They come in there and they fix any muscle problems that are existing. All right, now on to muscle fiber or myofibers. Muscle cells are long, cylindrical, and they're multinucleated, which we already knew that, but it's always good to repeat stuff that we really need to know. Sarcolemma is the muscle cell membrane, okay? So each muscle cell is surrounded by this membrane, and we call it the sarcolemma. And sarcoplasm is filled with tiny threads that are called myofibrils and myoglobin, all right? So just like when we studied the cell, we called it the fluid-like matrix inside the general cell, cytoplasm. For a muscle cell, we call it sarcoplasm. And within the sarcoplasm, we see myofibrils and myoglobin. And if you remember from our vocabulary, we discussed the other day that myoglobin is kind of like hemoglobin for the muscle cells, okay? It's red in color, and it's the oxygen binding protein that exists in muscle cells. Now, we've got these little things called transverse tubules. Transverse, if you remember, goes across, okay? So this is going to be going across the different muscle fibers, okay? T-tubules or transverse tubules are the elongated tube, and they're found at the end of each A-band, I-band junction, all right? So we need to talk about A-band, I-band junctions as well. These tubules are filled with extracellular fluid, which this is outside of each cell, extra outside of each cell. And they carry muscle action potentials down into the cell. All right? These tubules are responsible for getting those action potentials into the cell so the muscles will contract. Okay? And we see here this is a single muscle cell right here. And we got our I band and our A band coming together. All right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to it. All right, mitochondria, which remember, those are those energy-producing cell organelles, they lie in rows throughout the cell. They lie near the muscle proteins that use ATP during contraction. So those muscle proteins, which we learned in our vocabulary, were the actin and myosin. All right, so our mitochondria are going to lie next to those to provide them with enough energy that they need, those ATP molecules, as the contraction process begins and ends in the middle of it as well. Okay, so now we got our myofibrils and myofilaments. These are within the sarcoplasm. All right, muscle fibers, they're filled with threads called myofibrils. All right, and here are the myofibrils that are within each muscle fiber. And these myofibrils are separated by sarcoplasmic reticulum. And our myofilaments, which are the thick and thin filaments and are the contractile proteins of the muscle. The myofilaments are the actin and myosin proteins, and they do alternate with each other, and they produce those I bands and A bands that we would see in the muscle cells, and they're the contractile proteins. The actin and myosin heads, they do act together to contract the overall muscle fiber, which in turn will contract the entire muscle as they do this together. Okay, now back to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. If we were to break this down a little bit more, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is a system of tubular sacs a lot like the smooth endoplasmic reticulum in non-muscle cells. Okay. It stores your calcium ion in relaxed muscle, and it releases calcium ion that triggers muscle contraction. So here's another application of calcium and where calcium is applied in the human body. Not only do we need it for bones, but we need it for muscle contractions. Okay. Now, this is talking a little bit about muscles and stuff like that as we work them and don't work them. Atrophy and hypertrophy. Atrophy is a wasting away of muscles, which means the muscle is degrading, getting smaller. We see here this person curling his or her arm. We've got the normal muscle and how it's getting, we're showing it's healthy, it's contracted. An atrophied muscle, it has decreased in size, decreased in strength, and decreased in mobility. Oftentimes we see people who have been sick for a long period of time, their muscles will atrophy. They get really skinny, scrawny, and weak, and they have trouble moving around. Oftentimes we see this mostly with geriatric patients. We see this with older people who just have a rough time getting around. As we see here, atrophy is caused by disuse which could be disuse atrophy, or the severing of a nerve supply, which is denervation atrophy, okay, which those words kind of explain themselves. And this happens because there's a transition to connective tissue that cannot be reversed. As the muscle tissue dies, it's going to die. It's not going to come back, and it's irreversible as the muscle is converted into connective tissue. And we know a little bit more about connective tissue now. Connective tissue's job is to protect and to support. It really doesn't have the action potentials that muscle tissue would. And here we see hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is an increase in diameter of muscle fibers resulting from very forceful, repetitive muscular activity and an increase in myofibrils and sarcoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria. So hypertrophy, we have an example in this picture here showing the result of hypertrophy of the heart, which is a bad deal for an individual who's experiencing this. Okay, hypertrophy of your heart is showing that the ventricles themselves don't have enough space anymore to accept blood from the veins. So in turn, as that happens, when the heart contracts and sends this blood off to the lungs to be oxygenated, and then it comes back in and gets sent back out, there's not going to be enough volume going in and out of the heart, which can cause it to contract harder and more often, which it'll just continue to cause this hypertrophy within the heart muscle, which is not a good deal. Another possibility would be hypertrophy. Hypertrophic exercise can cause skeletal muscles, to become larger and larger also because of these very forceful, repetitive muscle repetitions. Okay, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy leads to larger muscles. This would be because of a little force, non-functional muscle. This causes an increase in sarcoplasm and mitochondria and non-contractile proteins that do not directly contribute to muscular force. All right, so here this is a building up of the myofibrils, sarcoplasmic reticulum and mitochondria, but here this is an increase in the sarcoplasm, mitochondria, and non-contractile proteins. Okay, so there's a little bit of a difference in this. Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is triggered by increased repetitions, and we see here bodybuilders, like this person I think, they tend to use 10 to 15 reps, which leads to quick and massive increases in size. All right. When they do their exercises. All right, so hey, these are your notes. This is the end of the notes. Oh, one more, never mind. We have one more, myofibrillar, that's hard to say, myofibrillar hypertrophy, which builds athletic strength, functional muscle, which is greater for production. Actin and myosin, contractile proteins, increase in number. Okay, so that means that's the number of little proteins inside there doing the contraction, which is a very good deal, which adds to muscular strength. It's a small increase in size of the muscle, and this happens because of a low number of repetitions and heavy weight, usually in sets in 1 to 3 reps. Okay, use massive weights to build strength for little muscle growth, and you get 3 to 6 reps for each set using small weights. All right, so this is just differences in the different types of hypertrophy. Hypertrophy in general is just the enlarging of a muscle because of overuse and force. Then we've got the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and then the myofibrillar hypertrophy, which is the result of different exercises and so on. So those of you involved in athletics, you intentionally do different workouts for different purposes. Some of those different workouts could lead you to sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Other ones will be myofibrillar hypertrophy. Okay, and we can talk about this a little bit more once we get in class. All right, that concludes your notes. Go back and take your time answering that essential question. You should get it from this information right here. Do a good job with it, and we will talk about this a little bit more in class. All right, have a wonderful day.